The naked lady who stood on her head.
We all dreaded the page, psychiatry to room 6. That meant that the police were bringing in the most difficult, hard to handle patients. I opened up the door and there was a naked lady standing on her head.
The man whose penis was shrinking. He was a partner in a big law firm or something?
Law firm downtown, so a very bright guy, and you wouldn't notice that he was psychotic. He believed his penis was shrinking. And he was on the couch and he kind of had a mirror and he was applying an ointment.
And his pants were down at his ankles?
His pants were down.
Today, he's seen and heard it all, and I do mean it all. Dr. Gary Semel from UCLA, one of the nation's top psychiatrists, shares some of the most bizarre cases from his practice. He's author of The Naked Lady Who Stood on Her Head. Pleasure to meet you, Dr. Semel.
Nice to meet you, Greg.
I just read this book with all the crazy cases.
They seem too bizarre to be true, but they're true.
And why don't we just start right there, The Naked Lady Who Stood on Her Head.
Well, I was a first-year psychiatry resident back at Mass General Hospital in Boston.
Sure.
And we all dreaded the page, psychiatry to room 6. That meant that the police were bringing in the most difficult, hard to handle patients. So you go to room 6, it's in the emergency room. I open up the door and there was a naked lady standing on her head. And I had to figure out, how do you deal with it?
Not something you see every day,
and
presumably.
And it's not in the textbook. You just don't know how to deal with it. And you kind of see me stumble through these different cases. And in fact, that time, I arrived at the diagnosis without even realizing it.
So yeah, that was interesting because there was actually more of a, say, a physical or physiological. Well, why don't you tell what happened?
It's actually a theme of the book where you see the interplay of the mind and the body. And in this situation, this woman was delirious. She had diabetes and had low blood sugar. So when I handed her a glass of orange juice, just because she seemed thirsty, she seemed to snap out of it. Now, at the moment, I thought it was my brilliant interviewing skills, but it really had more to do with the orange juice.
And the people that were kind of impressed, you said, right? Because at first I think everybody thought like, oh, here we go. But then you give her some orange juice and she
snapped out of it. And what you see in the whole process of this is what's going on inside my head. So throughout the book, the reader is like a fly on the wall in a psychiatrist's office. It's getting on the other side of the couch. So you really understand how we think, how we react to patients and situations, and you see the human side.
Sure, right, and I also like the fact that you shed light on the profession itself too. That psychiatrists are human and maybe even, as you will acknowledge, maybe have some of the same issues in some cases as the patients.
There's a lot of stigma to psychiatry. People are frightened that we're going to control people, your mind, take over, and people are afraid. And what the naked lady...
I'm afraid right now. Yeah.
Don't be afraid.
I kind of felt the mind control working, It's like...
It's not working. We are people, and we have reactions. The difference is we have some training and some understanding on how to deal with these situations, and we're committed to trying to help people. So if I have a reaction that's, say, negative, I try to control that so that it doesn't harm my patient.
Got to be professional.
That's right.
And you are. Well, the man whose penis was shrinking.
Well, that was another very unusual story. So it was a couple that was referred to me, and he was making partner at his firm, an attorney, and they had kids, and his wife was very anxious. She was kind of a fast talker, and you're kind of seeing this couple present, but when I bring up sex, he bolts from the office practically. He didn't want to talk about it, and it turned out they weren't having much sex, and he was being secretive. And as the story goes on, you find out that he is psychotic, that he's out of touch with reality.
And the thing is, he's what? He was a big attorney, like a partner in a big law firm?
Yeah, big law firm downtown, so a very bright guy, and you wouldn't notice that he was psychotic. It wasn't unlike a film or book people have read, A Beautiful Mind, where you have a brilliant mathematician, yet underneath that, there are voices and there are delusions. And in this case, he believed his penis was shrinking. And there's really no physiological cause for that.
That doesn't happen all that often, apparently, which is probably a good thing, but that's another story.
Yeah, it's unusual. A lot of us don't like to read about that, but you learn about how I helped him and helped his wife. And these kinds of problems you don't always cure, but you can really help people.
But really it got worse though, right? Because you actually walked in on him in the office treating himself?
Well, yes, this was there was a scene that was quite strange where he was applying an ointment to the part of his body he was concerned about. And that was kind of an unusual, so there's some humor in the book.
Yeah, because you came back from, no, he was early for the appointment or something, and you said, like, let yourself in, and you walk in the office, and
I was running late, and he was on the couch, and he kind of had a mirror, and he was applying an ointment.
His pants were down at his ankles.
His pants were down, which is not a great way.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get the audience the full effect, but
this is
not something you see every day again.
You don't see it every day, and so,
you're like, what in the hell are you doing?
That's exactly my reaction, and he was not fazed by it. I mean, this is all part of his delusion. He was applying his
just
treatment.
Doing my treatment.
Yeah. And so we increased his medication, which helped.
A lot.
It did. And the psychotherapy helped. In a lot of these situations, a combination of medication and talk therapy is tremendously effective.
Well, that's one thing I wanted to ask you about because, well, on the one hand, when you talk about some of the stigmas about psychiatry, or, we hear so much today about, well, even just in the general public, people abusing prescription medication, and it seems like there's a drug for everything, and yet, but you obviously feel that there's a very valid use for drugs in many of these cases, apparently. So, but is there a fine line there? I mean, do we tend to over-medicate as a society, or not?
Yeah, I mean,
it's...
Drugs can be used effectively, and sometimes they can be overused, and we see that in any area of life. I mean, human beings have a tendency to want more of a good thing, and sometimes too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And we deal with that in the book. There are situations where patients come in, and I'm wondering, are they just looking for medication, are they abusing drugs, or is this a medicine that may help them? So I think, there's a fine line sometimes, but there's a balance. It's not a good idea to say medications are all bad because sometimes people misuse them.
Okay, and so, I mean, obviously you feel it's an improvement over the days when maybe some of these medications didn't exist. I mean, if you were just trying to use talk therapy without any kind of medication, you may not make any progress.
Well, it's clear that psychiatry has come a long way over the last several decades. There are medicines for depression, for anxiety attacks, panic attacks. There are several cases in the book where we see a range of situations. There was a guy who had spontaneous panic attacks and developed what we call agoraphobia, or fear of just going outside, and how that was discovered and how effective the treatment can be to help people with these kinds of problems.
And that was interesting because he was from a very wealthy family and was like holed up in his mountain compound. That was another interesting thing in your book, by the way, that I'm assuming, well, because you're UCLA and in Westwood, I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems like you probably treat maybe a little wealthier clientele than the average, and maybe not, I don't know, maybe you have a range, but maybe they can't afford you, I guess is what I'm saying. But even then, in other words, these weren't downtrodden people necessarily. They were movie studio executives and top lawyers and doctors or wealthy families, but they were as nutty as anybody else, or had as many issues, to put it a little more nicely.
Yeah, money doesn't necessarily buy you sanity, and that's clear.
In fact, you came home and told your wife that one day, right? Like something like money can't buy you happiness or love or something like that after visiting him.
Well, I think these issues, what's interesting is you see the issues in the patients, and there are some less well-off patients, and there are certainly some patients who are very wealthy, and it doesn't protect them from mental illness. And you see what's going on with my patients, how I respond to it in terms of my own personal life. I mean, there are similar issues. So even though these are bizarre, unusual cases, there are lessons for all of us because they touch on issues that affect us all. For example, there was a guy in the book who would have felt better if he had cut off his hand. He wanted his hand amputated.
And I'm sorry, we'll pick up on that in just a second. We'll be right back. And we are back with Dr. Gary Small from UCLA. He's the author of The Naked Lady Who Stood on Her Head. And yes, the guy who wanted to cut off his own hand.
So he felt like he wouldn't be whole unless he got rid of this hand. It felt foreign to him. And I learned about it through his wife, who told me on Halloween he had a costume where he played the one-armed man from The Fugitive.
Wow.
Now, that's okay, that's kind of funny, but when he started wearing the costume after Halloween and just
wearing it every day,
what's going on with that? So he was hiding from his wife his true wish, And unfortunately, I had to hospitalize him at a certain point because he, coincidentally, he was a carpenter, and he told me about the power saw in his basement and these urges, and I was very concerned.
Because he kept coming into the emergency room, right, every so often with something wrong with his...
He kept injuring his hand. Hopefully, from his point of view, a surgeon might pick up on that and decide to amputate. So even though this is an extreme, and this is actually a form of body identity dysmorphic disorder that is relatively rare and may actually not be treatable in the long run, but in the short run, we did help him. But how many of us don't have a bad hair day, or want to get some plastic surgery? So there are always issues.
But I don't want to cut off my head.
Well, that's true. For you, that would not be a good idea. And that's my professional opinion.
Makes it a little harder to do the talk show that way.
It really cuts into the show.
Yeah. Well, although if people think it's an improvement, then we got a problem.
Do you want to get a vote from the viewers as to what?
No. Okay. Let sleeping dogs lie there. But even when that happened, I thought, I'll be damned. There's even a diagnosis for that, or that was a recognized. I mean, have you ever come across something that you just felt was completely new? Or I guess just with so many people on the planet and psychiatry having been around long enough, everything's been through the mill once or twice. Or...
Yeah, generally you find a diagnostic category. There are other people who have seen similar kinds of cases, or there are people you may know with rare forms of it. But I think everybody's story is new and different. And that's one of the interesting things about being a psychiatrist or a therapist, is trying to get inside other people's heads and trying to be empathic, which is really a theme of the book, how often understanding another person's emotional point of view and conveying that understanding is a very powerful form of healing.
Right, and I noticed you mentioned that. And so you don't just see them as a type then?
Well, I think when we do that, or when I see myself labeling a patient, that's kind of a clue to me that what's going on? Am I having some anxiety? Is this person making me uncomfortable? Is that why I am distancing myself emotionally from that person? How can I learn from that? And so my own emotional reaction and template is really more diagnostic information for me to understand the patient better and try to help them.
Well, you also mentioned another case where, you found out, you hear about this in the news every once in a while, but the guy had multiple, the couple came in for counseling, and it turned out the husband, though, had multiple wives or multiple families.
Yeah, so the secret double lives, that came up, and of course you see it on television a lot, where people, often men, have second families in other cities. And so in this situation, the wife was feeling something's not right. Why is he buying a boat? He knows I get seasick. I don't like to go out on the ocean. And what's up with that? And why is he always out? And he is saying that it's her problem, that she's anxious or depressed because the kids are out of the house. It's empty nest syndrome. And we eventually, in a very surprising, dramatic scene, learn what's really up and how she deals with it.
As well, because the bill was misdirected or ended up in the other wife saw the bill.
Right. The second wife came in and was outraged that there was this bill from me. Am I trying to bilk her insurance company? And so we were able to put two and two together.
And you had to say no. And that was interesting because with patient confidentiality, there was only so much. You couldn't really, all you could say, it's a valid bill, but you couldn't say, no, your husband's a lying, cheating SOB who's got another wife that you don't know about.
Although the reader could hear my thoughts. But no, you're right. We have to try to respect people's confidentiality. So I was a little bit tongue-tied because of those rules.
But you would be able to tell the wife who was your patient and say, hey, this other woman came in today and thinks your husband's her husband?
Right, because that was, I didn't have a therapeutic agreement with this person who just happened to come in my office. She wasn't my patient.
And I guess also another case that must have been strange for you as a person was when you ended up being a therapist for your own mentor, who really, got you, or was instrumental in your own career.
That was challenging, and this often happens. One of my areas of specialty is in memory and Alzheimer's, and as it turned out, someone who had become a friend, had been a mentor over the years, came to me for some help. And there's an old saying, the doctor who treats himself as a fool for a patient, and probably the same thing about his family or friends, and so we try to avoid that. But there are certain situations where you can't avoid it completely, and so you learn about how I dealt with that, what the issues were, how he very gradually developed Alzheimer's, and how it was hard for me to recognize because I was emotionally involved. In fact, he was so smart, he picked up the diagnosis before I did. And I think it really brings up a lot of issues for many people who see their loved ones diminish right in front of them. They literally lose their minds very gradually, and how painful that is.
The interesting thing about his case was, because you mentioned he was someone who was, you know, high IQ and obviously academic and intellectual and very active mentally, and you'll hear studies, which I want to believe, that if you stay mentally active, you can help ward off Alzheimer's. But in his case, I mean, I guess that's not a 100% cure for anything or preventative. I mean, it's sometimes you're...
Yeah, it's not 100%, and it's not a cure. And in fact, many very bright people do get Alzheimer's disease. Now, certainly prevention is critically important, and we do a lot of research, and my wife Gigi and I have written many books on how to improve your memory and how to try to delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease through lifestyle choices. And he had a relatively healthy lifestyle. But it's clear we don't yet have a cure that will eradicate this illness as yet.
Now, you mentioned also that what you've devised, or one of the people who came up with a new test for Alzheimer's, finding plaque in the brain or that sort of thing?
Our group at UCLA was the first to invent a brain scan that can see the actual physical evidence of Alzheimer's disease in living people. It used to be they could only see it after autopsy, and the doctor would look under the microscope.
Now, how effective is that in early detection? Because I was just reading an article yesterday in USA Today, I think it was, which obviously is in a medical journal, but they were saying, you know, there is no effective test, or, you know, that it's hard to detect Alzheimer's early. And I kept thinking, Dr. Gary Small, his test, you need to do a brain scan. So, I mean, am I missing something there, or would this, I mean, are they wrong, or is...
Well, I would never contradict USA Today. Having said that, however, you know, there are tests. There's our tests. There are other kinds of tests that are giving us information earlier and earlier. And in fact, what we can see in the scans we've developed is decades before people develop symptoms, we can begin to see subtle evidence in the scan. Now, for many people, that sounds very scary. Oh my God, I'm in my 40s and I've got Alzheimer's. To me, it's cause for hope, because it means that we can start doing something before the brain has significant damage. It's going to be easier to protect a healthy brain rather than try to repair one once the damage sets in. So I'm hopeful we'll get some new prevention treatments beyond just lifestyle choices that will really slow down this devastating illness.
We'll be right back. And we are back with Dr. Gary Small. He is author of The Naked Lady Who Stood on Her Head. Okay, hysterical pregnancies. You can actually convince a woman, I think just women, correct me if I'm wrong, can convince themselves that they're pregnant.
Not only convince themselves, sometimes the doctor is fooled. It's really an extraordinary physiological, psychophysiological phenomenon.
Because they have the protruding belly?
Their bellies protrude, their hormones change, there's a lot of different physiological causes, and you find out about the details and the backstory of the case I saw as a trainee back at Mass General in Boston, and how for her, babies were very important in her family, and she wanted to be pregnant so bad that her mind made her body pregnant. It was really quite amazing.
You know, and that's one thing I wonder too when you see this. Do you see certain, I don't want to say neurosis or what the right word would be, but, you know, it's a society, like I say, there's so much pressure to, you know, you have to have a baby or something, so she, you know, thought or wanted to have a baby. Are there certain things that come up over and over again that maybe just because society tends to lean in that way that...
You know, there are always themes like that having to do with stress and anxiety, wanting to be accepted, wanting to not feel so alone. Again, why empathy seems to be very important, so people feel connected in their lives. And, you know, it even touches on another chapter where we dealt with mass hysteria, where groups of children, and sometimes adults, develop what appear to be physical symptoms, but it's really a psychological cause, and it can be quite disruptive to communities, and people often are very upset when you tell them, you know, this illness is all in your mind. They get very defensive.
Right, because, okay, so no offense, but, or, you know, I mean, well, because you're a psychiatrist, that's what you're supposed to do, but you may have some crazy patients, but you would think in a school that not everybody would be crazy or have some kind of mental, so how does that work in a group where presumably it's a lot of different kinds of people? How does mass hysteria take
Well, what
hold?
often happens, it's a group that's under some kind of stress, and there's some kind of a system, a social system, where there are influential people. So in a school system, you might see one of the class leaders get sick, or maybe he had a stomach ache and he fell off the stage, and then another student sees that, and then maybe they're a little hungry and they start feeling faint, and they see other people get faint, and gee, I just smelled some odor, and the next thing you know, everybody's running from the auditorium and they're hyperventilating. It becomes an incident, and it's quite extraordinary, and it happens lots of times. Over the years, I've probably investigated half a dozen or a dozen of these cases, sometimes involving attorneys and lawsuits, sometimes nations. I mean, I've been called up by foreign ministers in countries from around the world asking how to deal with these kinds of situations.
Wow, wow. And then you even have the case of, I've heard of medical students who sometimes think that they're suffering from every illness.
Right. Medical studentitis or medical student
yeah.
disease. Right.
But you had a patient who actually...
Medical studentitis by proxy. So this was a case where the medical student's mother was referred to me because the student's psychiatrist thought the mother was maybe a little bit overbearing. And she seemed to be quite knowledgeable about medicine. I thought she was a doctor when I first met her. And she was
spouting off medical terms.
Oh my goodness, she knew more terms than I did. She was quite an astute diagnostician. And it turned out that she wanted to get closer to her son and was studying up on all his coursework and had gotten all his books. He was outraged when he found out about it, and I tried to help them work through the conflict.
Wow. And a lot of times, though, I noticed that you would end up bringing in, you know, it wasn't just one person. You might bring in the spouse or the parent or someone. I mean, in other words, there were a couple of people usually involved in the situation. And is that sometimes you just have to, if you're really going to do something with it, you have to?
Families are very powerful units. You may notice, I don't know if you ever, I imagine you don't live with your parents anymore?
No.
Are your parents still alive?
Yes, they are, yeah.
So you probably go home and have dinner with them occasionally, or?
Several times a year, yeah.
And do you find yourself sitting in the same seat? And if your siblings are there, you might have similar arguments. My point is, families are very powerful units, and it can be a really important vehicle to help people change. And so there are family sessions and couple sessions, and I think that's very helpful.
All right. Well, I guess, did you have anywhere to go from here? Or have you?
I didn't mean to probe too much into your family life. I'm sorry, Greg, if I did that.
Oh, no, actually, I'm very much looking forward to Thanksgiving.
Well, that's great. You know, I think to have a family support group is very important because, you know, it protects us from the cruelty of the world. And we want to help people with that. We want to help them with their relationships. We want to help them deal with the world so they don't have to suffer from mental illness. There's, you know, probably 1 out of every 4 of us will have some kind of mental problem at some point in our life.
I was astounded when I read that figure that you had. But I wondered, you know, with all of I wonder over the years if you've seen a change in society, because with talk shows and, you know, the books and the TV therapists and that sort of thing, are people more aware? You know, there was a sense that maybe there was a time when you didn't talk about a lot of things, and even, and as you said, there may still be a stigma about going to a therapist or whatever, but have society become more sophisticated about certain things or not? I mean, you know, have we evolved any or not?
I think some segments of society have. There's more sophistication about therapy and getting psychiatric help, but there's still a tremendous stigma. A lot of people don't get help because they're afraid of it. And in the book, our hope is that people will not be so frightened. They'll see that a lot of these conditions can't always be cured. Sometimes they can almost be cured, but it can really get people back on track in their lives. And that's tremendously important and gratifying.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gary Small.
Thank you, Greg.
The book is The Naked Lady Who Stood on Her Head. Thanks, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next time.